Everyone. As everyone starts to join, we will get started momentarily. I see a number of people joining in. Thank you for joining us tonight. We will get started in around 30 seconds. Super. I think we're ready to start. Well, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us on this webinar entitled Play Safe, Play Strong Safety Tips for Every Season. We are joined by an expert from the great people at Nemours Children's Health, Dr. Matthew Harris. We're going to talk about Dr. Harris momentarily. But just to tell you a little about tonight's session, you can see us, but we cannot see you. You're on mute, but please use the Q&A box to ask any questions that you have during this webinar. Share your questions as they arise. If you have some questions, that means there's going to be numerous others that are probably thinking the same thing. So we would definitely want to make sure that we are answering your questions tonight. We will do our best to address all of them in this presentation. And this presentation is being recorded and will be emailed to everyone who RSVP'd after tonight's event. Now I want to talk to you about our great expert, Dr. Harris. He is a therapy manager at Nemours for physical therapy. He has his PT, DPT, and CSCS. He's a board-certified physical therapist with 15 years of experience in youth sports medicine. He earned his doctoral of physical therapy degree at Thomas Jefferson University and has practiced at Nemours Children's Health, specializing in pediatric and adolescent sports physical therapy. Matthew's clinical interests include managing and preventing overuse injuries, with a particular focus on overhead athletes. He has partnered with youth sports organizations throughout the country to provide education on overuse injury prevention and the risks of early sports specialization. Matthew currently serves as sports therapy manager at Nemours Children's Health, Chase Fieldhouse. And so welcome, Doctor. We are going to be covering tonight for our audience several different learning objectives. We're going to help you understand the overuse of injuries. About half of youth today, those injuries come from overuse. We're going to learn what raises the risks for your child before how to prepare before the season, get season ready with preseason conditioning and a simple prep checklist. We'll also give you great tips on building year-round habits for your child, supporting that long-term growth with rest, smart nutrition, and cross-training. Then we'll also talk about recovering the right way with making the warm-ups and cool-downs and the rest of the days part of everyday routines. And then also knowing the warning signs, spotting the early signs of injury, and know when to seek medical help. With that said, a couple months ago, we had a great guest speaker on our podcast, and his name was Jordan Wolf. Jordan was considered one of the greatest lacrosse players that ever played for Duke University. He's also was an All-American athlete who was a multi-sport athlete in high school, but he was an All-American lacrosse player at Duke. He has gone down as one of the greatest lacrosse players that's ever played the game. And when we were interviewing him, he had something to say about some advice of how to get where he got to. So we're going to play this to start off our webinar.
Yeah, I think the great advice I got is you're always getting better, you're getting worse. Like it's very rare people plateau, I think. And that's happening to everyone. So if you really want to excel, you have to put a lot into it. But I also think, especially early on, like there shouldn't be any pressure from you, your family, coaches. Like you should be doing things because you enjoy it and you want to get better. I think if you look at sports in that light, it's really easy to want to work really hard at it. If it becomes a burden on you, or you're not enjoying it as much, like in anything in life, it's gonna be really hard.
So I've had the honor to work with Jordan and his two other brothers since they were ESF lifer campers. They were legends. They came to our camps for over 10 years each. And I watched these kids grow up. They had max joy in every sense, but they loved sports. They were those types of kids that just would pick up something, they would kind of master it, and then they loved it. They weren't playing one sport year round. They were playing multiple sports all the way through high school. And when we started talking this interview about overuse and looking back as he was specializing as he went into college, he dropped the hockey and he just started to play lacrosse. He was hyper focused on this as well as his academics. And when he came in as a freshman at Duke, he saw that all these other kids were specializing at an earlier age, and he had a lot of work in his eyes that he needed to do to be able to compete with them. Little did he know that he picked it up very quickly and was able to excel well beyond some of his peers when he got to Duke. But when I asked him for one tip, one message, this is what he said.
So if you could go back and speak to yourself as an ESF camper to Jordan at age 11, what would you tell?
To not put so much pressure on myself and not have the stress of it all at a young age. I feel like it's all gonna work out. That's probably what I would do. That's more of a me thing, just my personality. But there's just no substitute playing sports with people you grew up with or your family grew up with. Like those are my best, most fond memories. So I wish I could tell myself to really enjoy it at the time, even though I was 10 years old. But there's nothing like your best friend you grew up with on your street, going to camp together, playing sports. There's just no.
So just this past weekend, we had the honor to actually produce a program which was the top 20 high school basketball players, both male and female, around the world for New Bounce in Boston. And it was a 4-day program. We didn't even call it a camp. We called it an experience, which was two tracks. One was for the elite athletes, and the second was for the parents. And we designed it so it was really focusing in on mental health, on performance, on character development, and on financial literacy. Now, granted, these are 20 male and female student athletes who are somewhere between the ages of 16 and 17 years old. By far, they are going into the NBA and WNBA within the next 4 to 6 years, depending upon when they would turn pro. And this is our second year doing it, and I was really amazed, which I had this discussion with Dr. Harris yesterday. I was really amazed to watch how these young elite athletes were focused on their game. They were extremely disciplined. They were hyper focused on their performance. And I did see somewhat of a little bit of a lost joy in the game. And I feel that in today's athletic, kind of journey, there is younger campers that are now going into one specialized sport, and which is causing almost the burnout and the overuse of injuries. And today's guest speaker, Dr. Matthew Harris, is the perfect person to talk about the age that we're living in right now. So welcome, doctor, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Hey, thank you, Michael. I appreciate it. Yeah. So I guess most of my day I spend talking about, youth sports and things like that. And so I spend my day around treating kids who have come in some sort of injury. And this 3.5 million, children 14 years on there treated for sports injuries. This is a little outdated, but I think it's a good representation and kind of shows you just the sheer volume of sports injuries that we see, and it's a lot, and it's growing because youth sports is growing. There's so many opportunities and things, and the kids are getting into sports and things like that, that we're just seeing a lot more. And about half of these injuries that we see are really due to overuse. And so just kind of taking in just a very broad overview when we talk about injuries and things like that, we can really label into two kind of groups. We got our traumatic injuries, that's you rolled your ankle, ACL tears, fractures, those kinds of things that are ultimately somewhat not preventable, right? That kind of happens out of the blue. And then you have those overuse injuries, and those overuse injuries are the ones that we really actually for the most part can prevent, right? And so I spend a lot of my day educating families, not only how we're getting back and what that looks like, but then ultimately how do we prevent this from happening again? So it's really a lot of my job is educating, and it's really one of my big passions is talking about how do we keep kids active and playing, because to me that's absolutely key is how do we keep them playing. And so there's this interplay between traumatic and overuse, and really what we want to do is how do we minimize these injuries, how do we go about that? And so when we think about it, there's really kind of two diagrams that we kind of think about, right? So everybody thinks about, oh, I need to prevent it in season, right? I got to work in season. That's where I need to kind of prevent. That's when we think about it, is when it happens, right? We don't really think about it before. Or maybe we're doing it a little bit in preseason, but really what we want to do is that second diagram is we want to be doing most of the work, the bulk of the work, the foundation during the off season, year round, then moving into the preseason, so that when we get to in season, everything is just kind of falling into place, right? The work has to be done year round. We're not talking about training year round. It's just thinking about that sport piece, okay? So really, when we talk about that year round, when we're coming off the season, we want to be able to have a break. I can't stress how important this is, and I know schedules are tough and we move from one sport to another, but some sort of break is absolutely key, some period of rest. So that's one of the big things that I often teach my athletes is that, hey, try and take a little bit of break somewhere. And it doesn't have to be complete rest. We're just talking some weeks off where you're not doing intense training, right? The off season is also this great time for us to really start to kind of focus in on our nutrition. And when I say that, like, we're not talking about, it's really trying different things, right? I want to know what meals work for me, what my hydration looks like. I want to know what that is during the off season. I don't want to be worrying about that during in season when schedules are crazy. I have practicing multiple hours a week and trying to figure that out. I want to know what foods work for me, how I feel when I eat them, and those things. That's the things you want to kind of try in the off season, is building those habits, trying new foods. All those things can be benefited and do on in the off season, right? The other big thing, and then Michael alluded to this, and even Jordan, is this idea of cross training or incorporated variety. So I do a lot of talking on diversification of sports and delaying specialization to a later age in kids, just because we know how they develop and how they're going through things. Early specialization can result into some issues, and we're kind of linking the dots of early specialization and overuse injuries and decreased performance, and ultimately not playing anymore, burnout, etc., with those things. And so what we find is trying to get kids to do things differently, because we develop different muscles, different organizational skills that help us ultimately in our primary sport. So cross training and incorporating variety in the off season or other activities year round is key. The other thing, if we want to work on our primary sport, work on technical skills, right? Like, the off season's a great time to adjust on my foul shot, or I'm going to work on my touch in soccer and my juggling and things like that, my footwork. I'm not doing it intensely. I'm not competing at a high level, but I'm still playing the game, but I'm doing it where I'm really focused on a specific thing and trying to kind of get myself a little bit better in that one area, but not at a high volume, not in a crazy training regime. I'm just going out and working on my game, but having fun while doing it. And I think one of the most underrated things to do in this offseason is, between families and their athletes and parents and their athletes, is this idea of developing communication, right? Too often than not, we talk about the season in the season, right? Let's talk about the season and develop a comfortable form of communication and an avenue of communication throughout the year, because then when it gets to in season and that child's just not feeling it, or they're injured and they just don't want to speak up to their coach or their other peers, they have a safe place to go to within you as a parent, that we can really start to address that. We get to see injuries a little bit earlier because they say, hey, I wasn't really feeling that. I've been bothered by my ankle for the past couple weeks. Opening communication lines early can be absolutely critical, and that will help us throughout the season. And then, so that builds our kind of foundation. And then we move into that kind of preseason checklist. This is really, in my mind, a kind of a checklist. We're getting ready, we're going through, all right? So one of the big things is we want to start to get into the activity before we actually start the activity, right? We want to be doing some sort of physical activity. We don't want to go from a couch potato to jumping in and doing 20 miles a week, right? We need to slowly start to build in. And so, organized high school sports generally have some of this kind of format, but even that bit of preseason still you need more on additional, in my opinion, right? You want to start working on your flexibility. This is a great time to get up, move, start getting yourself into some of those habits that hopefully you've developed during the off season, but we're starting to see that transition into a more rigid routine. We want to think about drinking more water, looking at our nutrition. Are we right where we need to be? Are we getting enough calories? Because we're definitely going to be ramping up our activities, so we want to make sure our caloric intake is about the same, right? The other thing we want to do, obviously, we live here, in the Philadelphia area, in a fairly temperate climate, okay? But, obviously, somewhere down in South Florida, if I'm transitioning to the heat, or, I've been in AC all summer, and now all of a sudden we got 2 days going, I want to make sure I'm getting acclimated to the heat before I'm starting to participate outside, right? So these are all things that we want to try and kind of think about. We also want to make sure our gear fits, right? Don't just drag out the hockey bag out of the thing and hope everything works. Check it. Is it in good condition, right? What do our pads look like? Do we need to replace anything? Do we need to get everything fixed? Do our skates need to be sharpened? All those things we want to kind of go through. And I think another thing that we really kind of want to think about and teach our athletes to do is start setting realistic goals for the season, right? Small goals can help us stay on track. We want to think about these things not as in I want achievements, but generally things we kind of want to accomplish, right? It's not I want to win a championship, we need to win a championship. It'd be nice to win a championship. Or we want to phrase it in a way where there's not really setting us in a letdown kind of sense, but something of a target, something to work to kind of drive through, that is kind of an intrinsic factor to kind of really motivate us as athletes. And I think preseason's also one of those great times. I know schools obviously require it for the most part, but getting a preseason physical with our primary factor. We can also do some baseline activities. So this is where getting baseline concussion screens and things like that are all beneficial to help us so that we're prepared in the case of somebody getting injured during the season, right? So if we move into now during the season, and again, hopefully at this point, everything's kind of really set in stone and automatic, right? We're just fine tuning, okay? But this is really where we start to see the wheels kind of fall off a little bit, okay? Because again, very, very busy schedule. Sports schedules are crazy these days, all right? I know speaking from trying to organize my 2 kids, it's often, takes a logistic with a whole calendar and things like that. So things we want to think about is encouraging this idea of warm up and cool down, right? I think warming up and kind of doing some sort of dynamic warm up pre-activity is getting very well established in most activities, right? I think that's pretty well known. I think the harder piece and the piece that we really fail and miss on is that cool down afterwards. I think that's a key piece because let's face facts. You've just trained for a couple hours or you've been doing some activity. You're tired. You want to go home. It's hard to really engage in that static stretching or that take care of the mobility work at the end where really we make a lot of those gains. So I think that's something that we really need to think about as parents is, hey, ask your child, did you do your stretches? Did you do your mobility work? Did you do your cool down? Did you take care of those steps that really help you from a longevity standpoint, right? NFL athletes, high professional athletes spend hours warming up and then spend hours afterwards. Now, given that's their job, but it's still, we want to take that structure and that idea of a really organized in and out of training so we make sure that we're taking care of our bodies. I think one of the things that we also just kind of generally a rule of thumb that we kind of live by or really stress is avoiding doing more hours of training per week than our age, right? If you're a 7-year-old, you should be doing about 7 hours of training per week, right? That's a kind of a general rule of thumb. You start to be a little bit older, you can handle a little bit more. I think it's hard, obviously, with schedules and being on multiple teams and things like that. And that's really where we kind of need to consider, well, how much are we doing? How much do we really need to do? Especially at those younger ages, I think we're a little bit more susceptible, and we want to try and avoid be doing too much. Hydration and fueling during the season, okay, thinking about how we're doing that. So general rule of thumb, 3 to 8 ounces of fluid for every 15 to 20 minutes of activity. Ideally, that's water or some sort of sports drink, not carbonated, not caffeinated or anything like that. My personal go-to, I love watered down, like Gatorade, Powerade, whatever. I like to cut it a little bit, is my personal favorite, basically like half, just because I want a little bit more water. It's not that the sport drinks are bad, but I generally just like to cut it a little bit. And then I think one of the things we often get hung up is this eating before and after, and what should I eat and how should I eat. I think about it as 3 to 4 hours before, or even like night before, we're trying to get like a fairly large kind of big carb meal. And then the 3 to 4 hours, we want something that's carbohydrate and then protein, a mix of that, not too heavy, not something serious, but something that's going to satiate us and fill us up fairly reasonably. And then 30 to 60 minutes, that's where we're kind of eating a banana, an applesauce pouch, something easily digestible, some crackers, just something that we have in our stomach. Playing in an empty stomach just generally doesn't work. I know when we have kids come in and haven't eaten breakfast and we're treating them, that usually never works out for us. So we always encourage kids to make sure you're eating a little bit of something. Something in your stomach can go a long way. And then afterwards, my big thing is the go-to is like chocolate milk, right? Like something that's going to fill you up, give you a little bit of some protein, give you some carbohydrate to kind of fill everything back up. And that's generally saying, you want to wait like 20, 30 minutes afterwards, but then it's trying to get something in you as well. Again, something easily digestible that's going to fill you up, but a little bit more heavy on the protein at that end point. And then the other thing is ensuring adequate sleep and recovery, right? Schedules are busy, and if you find and your athletes finding that they're not getting enough sleep, that might be something to look at in the schedule. Are we doing too much where they're not getting enough sleep at night? There's a lot of homework and things like that kids have to face, but we want to make sure that they're getting adequate rest, because that rest is actually what creates the healing that allows us to participate. So we're not getting those micro traumas over and over again. We have to repair that, right? And that's how we do it, is with that little bit of rest. That's what's key. And then we also want to recognize these signs of injury, right? So what are those signs, right? So that's where I think knowing a baseline and having this communication pattern are absolutely key, right? I want to know what my child's general performance is. Do I start to see a dip in their performance, in the sense like you can see they're just not into it as much, right? Do they start dragging their feet when they're going to practice and things like that? Are they just tired all the time? These are all things that can be signs of overtraining and things. Are they starting to kind of just, what do they look like when they're doing the warm up and doing things? Is it just not what they're expecting? I often ask parents, like, you guys are the experts, right? I've never met your child before, so I always turn to them and say, is this typical for them, right? Because they're really the experts, and they're kind of watching them go through practice, and they kind of know. So that really helps me in guiding that things, but really just kind of keeping tabs. And that's where it's that open lines of communication and asking, how are we feeling? How's this practice been going? You'll get some answers. If you're getting those short one-word answers and they're not really engaged about it, it might be a good time to ask some of those deeper questions of, what's going on, kind of thing. So,
Dr. Harris, this is where I think this slide is pretty powerful, because I think as a nation, we are falling short doing this as a ritual for youth development right now. And when I look at, we just all experienced the World Cup, and watching these amazing athletes from different nations come over to compete. And some of these athletes were, in their latter years, are performing at a high level, even higher than our young U.S. team. And I feel that right now, with the way youth development is happening in certain sports, pretty much in every sport, we're seeing this overuse, and which is why this is such an important webinar. We are, I think, failing our generation right now, and we really should take a look at these 4 steps, because it's really ingrained in every international youth development program, except in the U.S. I mean, we're pushing too much of these energy drinks. We're doing this race to nowhere, starting specialization at too young of an age. We're not doing the cool downs. Sometimes the warm ups are very short. we're not going through the rituals to really prevent the the injury overuse. And then obviously sleeping and recovering is critical. I'll use this as an example. When I was growing up, I was a multi-sport athlete. I was nationally ranked in tennis. I was a hockey player, and I was fortunate enough to peak at a later age when I was in college. And I really feel like it had a lot to do with the fact that I was not specializing in one sport. And when I would go to nationals as a 14-year-old, I would get crushed by people in California or Florida or Texas, all the hot states. Um, and it wasn't until college I was playing some of these people that were nationally ranked that I was losing to as a teenager, that I was beating them. I couldn't understand it. I didn't feel like I was, as good as them, but I was somehow beating them. And I found out later that it's because they were already injured. They had a major operation. They hated the sport. They were they were burnt out, and they hated their parents because they were being pushed. And so I find that this is happening now in every sport, and kids are specializing way too young. And for some reason, we as a nation are not following kind of the playbook that international athletes are doing. And when you track players like LeBron James or like Novak Djokovic, these are two players right now in their respective sports that are being highlighted because of their age and the fact that they're being considered as the greatest of all time. I know that, for instance, with ESPN and the U.S. Open and the French Open and the Wimbledon, they'll follow Novak after his match to see to interview him, and they'll go to his cool down where he's on a bike and he's on for 20 minutes before he's going to talk to somebody. And the cool down, same thing with LeBron James. I mean, they have this down as a ritual, and they've been doing it as a youngster, but as a routine. And so that recovery process is so important. And I know this next slide is something, Dr. Harris, that you really believe in. And the research that's been done on the long-term athlete development is something that we as parents really need to look at. And what this really means is you can't push it too early in an age. And so I'll let you take it from here, Doctor, because I do think this is something that we're failing as parents and program providers to really follow.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that we talk a lot on, and it really is a huge push in the sports medicine community. Is this idea of long-term athlete development and this idea of physical literacy, and what does that really mean in this whole thing? And really, what we've kind of found is that we've established that we know with typical development there are periods of windows in these typical development where skills are acquired, right? And everybody's growth curve is a little bit different and things like that. And so we have those early peak kids, and they seem to be these high athletes at a younger age, right? And then they have the late peaker. Well, sometimes that late peak kid is the one who's actually spending more time in some of these earlier phases and actually ends up having a more successful athletic career because they spend a little bit more time in that period of where they're developing things like that and creating neural networks and things like that. And it wasn't such a rush to get to competition, right? And so we've really taken a look back at it and kind of taken athletes and looked at some of this, and we've said, well, what are we really doing? And they've kind of set up these different, diagrams and things like that, where we've basically said, like, there's different things we need to be focused on at different ages, right? The competition will come, right? And it's not to say that we don't want any competition at the young ages. Nobody wants to keep just doing training or anything like that at a young age, right? It's not that. It's just the emphasis isn't as much on competition, right? We're not striving for them to be competing in many tournaments throughout the year. Yes, they have some tournaments, they have some games. That's part of the fun of sports, is competing, right? But a lot of what they're focusing on is fundamental skills, teaching and learning those fundamental skills, learning how to play the sport, getting some mental IQ when it comes to that sport, where are you supposed to be in space, moving those things, and learning actually how to train, right? What does your body absolutely need? Those are key things that young athletes never really get, right? Because we just kind of rush them into some competition, or we spend some time, focusing on one sport here, there, or the other. They don't really learn how to play and just be active and have fun in different parts of the game. So we've really started to push that concept of we need to kind of push our system so that we're not focused so much on the competition at an early age. We're more focused on just general development of skills and this idea of physical literacy, the ABCs, agility, balance, coordination, those things. Those are the founding blocks of our, our physical language. Much like the alphabet is our founding of, vocal and learning to read, right? We need those blocks, those building blocks, to be able to do higher level skills. And we learn those at a younger age. And too often we skip over that period or move through that period too fast and don't allow kids to adapt and learn a lot more. And that ultimately sets them up for they're having these overuse injuries, they're getting tired, they're getting burnt out, and we're losing potentially, high level athletes because they just peaked a little too early or did too much too soon. And we really are doing ourselves a disservice, and we're trying to kind of adjust the narrative and really figure out what works, what doesn't, and trying to kind of adjust that.
Doctor, we definitely saw that last week at our New Balance event for the Elite Basketball Invitational, where there were student athletes from around the world, and the international athletes far surpassed the domestic athletes, and these were kids from Iceland, Mexico, Germany, and different parts of Europe who were far excelling. Same age, same kind of skill sets, but it's really, after getting to know their parents, it was really all based around the fact that they were multi-sport athletes leading up to age 15. These are mostly 16, 17-year-olds that were there, and it was unbelievable to see. You could see the difference in development and the joy of the sport, by the way. So.
Yeah. I think I don't know the exact statistic, but there's statistics I love to share with families and stuff like that. And I think it's like something like 95% of the NFL's first round draft picks all were multi-sport athletes in high school, right? And so you think of those are very high elite athletes, peak of the performance, and they were doing multi-sports in high school, and that's because, again, development of different movement systems helps us ultimately in our primary sport, right? So, and especially doing that early is absolutely key. We really, really want to try and encourage that as much as we possibly can. And that's not to say that a child can't play. If they'd love to play soccer and that's what they want to do, absolutely. But then think about how they're training throughout the year, right? Is it all just training to get to the game that we're focused on for the weekend? Or are we working on building skills, teaching them teamwork, those kinds of things as we're going along? And oh, by the way, we're playing some games and having some fun as we're doing it. And we're doing that at a young age. And then we're teaching them the skills that they need so that when they get to that higher level, the competition goes up, they're able to be successful, or they're not just too tired from doing everything.
Great. Thank you. Where would there be some great resources that we could turn to, Doctor, if parents were interested in learning more?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the U.S. Center for Safe Sports, there's a huge push on this concept of safe sports participation, whether it's talking about sporting equipment or, heads up campaign. The CDC has the heads up campaign. There's a lot of that out there. So I think Nemours has a resource, Kids Health, which has a lot of different things. The Aspen Institute is one of my favorite resources to go to. So they do a lot of involved with their project plan, where they basically look at past data and they're looking at participation data and when are kids, finding these things about burnout, and really how do we address some of that and that narrative around that. And Stop Sports Injury used by the National Children's Youth Sports is one of those, another great resources. I think there's a lot of resources out there. It's kind of combing through and going through and kind of getting that message. And a lot of it is the same message. It's just how we kind of adapt it and how do we implement it, right? The American Academy of Pediatrics has this diagram down here where it just kind of putting it in there, right? How are we putting into recovery? What are we talking about with specialization, playing a variety of sports, pushing this idea of diversification early and later specialization. So this information is now starting to be pretty consistent as we go through resources, which is really nice, whereas before it was kind of very sparse. But we're getting to the point where it's pretty consistent throughout.
Fantastic. Thank you, Doctor.
Yep.
We have had several questions that have been submitted tonight from our audience. And it's a full range of different ones. So if you don't mind tackling a few of these.
Yeah.
So one question's coming from a parent who's got kids between the ages of 5 and 8. And the question is, what are some morning before school exercise routines that would be appropriate for my kids to do?
Yeah, this is an interesting question because, so I think my big thing is look at the training and how we're doing about it. So, are we talking about what are we wanting to be doing? Are we wanting to do like some strength training, some things early on? To me, with that young age, what we want to engage in is just getting them active and moving. So, believe it or not, these things like Tai Chi, I'm a huge fan of these new ideas around, we see it a lot in our geriatric population, but we've kind of moved it to more of that athletic population. This idea of general movements just to kind of get ourselves woken up and do it. I tell you, I've been doing it. It's been fantastic. It wakes up my spine, feels great. But those kinds of movements are really, really good to kind of get moving. Early on, doing some sort of activity, whether it's, we don't want to do something heavy as we're talking about like before school or early in the day, right? So our training needs to be kind of fairly easy, especially at this younger population. We don't want to be doing a lot of volume before the day goes on just because they fatigue so much faster and we're still building a lot of muscle, okay? But early on is a good time where, if kid really wants to be playing soccer or soccer's their favorite sport, after they've done breakfast and all that stuff, they go out and they juggle for a little bit, right? That skill-oriented thing earlier in the day is great because we're still fresh, we're ready to go. Okay, we've warmed up, we got ourselves moving a little bit. It's a great way to get us ready for the day as well. But we don't want to be doing heavy training early on, especially with the younger population.
What's the appropriate age to start weight training?
It's a question I get all the time: is when is too early? And I think my general rule of thumb is they need to be able to follow instructions, right? They There has to be some sense of the goal of what are we trying to accomplish, right? For younger kids, we're not really trying to gain muscle mass. It's just not going to happen. The lack of, they haven't gone through puberty and things like that. They're not going to be building muscle. So, right, the focus is generally teaching them the movement patterns that they need to be able to do so that when they move on later in life and they are able to start putting on and starting to gain strength and things like that, is going to be anything early on is going to be neural adaptation. So the key is being able to follow instructions, listen, those kinds of pieces. Usually we're talking about around the ages 8, 9, 10 is usually the earliest that I generally say these kids are kind of, and again, it should be focused on the fundamental principles, right? Fundamental movements, learning where you should be in the gym, those kinds of things. It's really about what it is. Teaching them safety, how much should you be lifting? And those things are all going to come into place, but it's really where should you put the bar? Where should you be spotting? Those kinds of questions and things like that need to be taught, and so that as they move through, they're a little bit safer. But I think generally speaking, my rule of thumb is I usually say 9, 10 is kind of my cutoff.
Great, thank you. What are the best foods to ensure children are eating appropriately before and after sports? And what is your thoughts on drinking Gatorade or Powerade or any of those types of energy drinks?
Yeah, I think well, we draw the line kind of at the energy drinks. So, like, if we're talking about like those, if we're talking about, they have a lot with the caffeine and things like that, and so it's really not what we want to kind of be doing. I think Gatorade, Powerade, those kinds of things are okay. The like Propel Fitness water, those kinds of things are good, and generally saying water is great, but obviously if long duration activities, you're going to need some sort of carbohydrate in there. And that's really where Gatorade and Powerade really kind of come in handy, especially if you're losing a lot of electrolytes through sweat and stuff like that. It's really finding a balance. Like, what is the activity you're doing? How long are we doing it? Okay. What do you have access to? What do you like to drink? Right. That's always a big question is, what do you feel comfortable drinking? Most of the times, most athletes will just say, like, during practice, I want to be drinking water, right? I just want a quick water. Okay. Especially as I'm moving and doing some things. If there's a little bit more down periods, that's where kind of some of those Gatorades and Powerades are generally pretty good to kind of do. I think when it comes to food choices, that's a very big personal preference. I mean, I'm not a nutritionist by any means, nutritionist at all, but I think in my personal experience and what I've suggested to athletes is, think about something, especially before, we don't want something heavy in our stomach, something light, easily digestible. Okay, I mentioned a banana, applesauce, granola bar, something quick, crackers, that's going to be in there and give us something a little bit there. When we're talking about kind of pre meals, those big meals. We got my daughter hooked on Bryce. We call them Bryce Harper sandwiches, which is basically a turkey and cheese sandwich, which is what Bryce Harper actually, he's read an article one of them. That's what he likes to eat before a game, a couple hours before a game. But it's great. You're getting the roll, so you're getting some carbohydrates. You're getting turkey's lean protein, something simple that you can eat quick, fast, but it's going to give you enough energy to help satiate you and keep you moving for the game. And then the key, definitely on the post, is making sure you're getting something that's going to replace what you lost, right? That's usually where you want protein to help with the recovery of the muscles. Okay, you definitely want some carbohydrates. I love chocolate milk as a post-workout kind of drink. I know it's kind of hard to think about drinking milk like right after activity. That's why I usually say wait 20, 30 minutes and then you kind of drink that. But then you're getting the carbohydrates from the sugars, simple sugars, and then getting some protein as well.
Doctor, any tips on how to help children eat more green vegetables?
If I could get them eating green vegetables, if I could get my son to eat some green vegetables, I would be a hero. I think a lot of it is, and we talked about doing some of this, during the off season, right? Trying to work on some of those habits during the off season. I think a lot of it is trial and error, trying it in a variety of different ways, and thinking about what might work. Is it steamed? Are we sautéing? Are we putting salt on? Are we doing different seasonings and those things? It's trying to find those kinds of things that we can kind of go and do. But I think trying to do that during the off season is key, because then when you're rushing and trying to do it during the in season, and an athlete's tired, they're not going to want to experience new food at that point, right? there's a little bit of a barrier. It's like, I just want to eat, I want to go to bed, or I want to relax. I don't want to have to be doing this battle of trying something new, right? If it's something I don't like, my palate might not be there. So developing that palate during the off season is a great idea.
Now, with little girls who are kind of in that growth spurt, one of the parents has asked the question of how do you avoid the repetitive motion injuries in girls?
Yeah, and I think that's really where that diversification comes into play, right? So, obviously, if you're going to be doing a sport and you're doing a sport year round, you just can't be doing the same movements over and over again. And that's where it's okay. If we're doing a sport year round, let's take baseball or softball for this instance. Okay, you're going to have your fall league where you're participating in games and things like that. And then really in the winter, that's where we kind of see that period of working on skill development and things like that. And that's really where you want to reduce the amount that they're doing, but then you're trying to kind of do something else. So I encourage them doing some sort of other activity, trying to incorporate that so that they're being as active during those downtimes. We're not just doing the same movement patterns over and over again. I think Mike Trout famously said, like, during the off season, he doesn't even pick up a baseball. He'll maybe throw a football around or something like that, but he doesn't touch a baseball at all. He'll do something else completely and then comes back to the baseball. His off season's a little bit different than everybody else's, but like that idea of I'm just kind of separating myself from the sport for a little bit and doing something different to give my muscles a break, but I'm still being active and doing something, so I'm not going stir crazy.
Doctor, is there any suggestion that you have in terms of good nutrition diets for youth?
I think it comes down to a balanced nutrition, right? So making sure we're getting protein, carbohydrates, and enough calories. I think that's something that we often miss, is we want to make sure we're getting enough calories. So knowing and kind of having a general idea, there's a lot of caloric counters online and things that you can do to kind of get a general sense. They're not perfectly accurate, but the idea of knowing how much energy am I expending and how much do I need to put in. Because as an athlete, if you're not putting in what you're putting out, you're going to have catastrophic issues, right? We need to make sure we're putting in enough to continue to be able to fuel our bodies for what we're doing and making sure we're getting proper fuel, right? So we want to try and avoid those high fatty foods as much as we possibly can, especially during the season and things like that, okay? And around competition periods and things like that. So, but the simple idea of making sure I'm balanced between carbohydrates, fats, protein, some sort of sense of that, and getting that, the food pyramid, as long as it's been around, is great resource and is actually pretty accurate when it comes to the athlete as well. Okay, we add a little bit here and there, but generally speaking, that general balanced diet is absolutely key.
Dr. Harris, I want to thank you. This has been extremely educational for all of us. I think huge takeaways for us is without a doubt the warm up and the importance of cooling down with that dynamic stretching before and after to make sure you're loosening up one's body. The second is really avoid doing more hours than the age. I think a lot of that overuse is coming because coaches aren't really properly coaching, and they're demanding certain types of training methods when it really is affecting the youth development. A third is the hydration and the fueling is critical to drinking as much ounces as your body weight when it comes to if you're 60 pounds, you want to be drinking as close to 60 ounces as you can from what the experts are saying. And then really making sure that you're eating before and after. And the chocolate milk was a great tip. We're seeing a lot of athletes today doing that. And then last but not least, the sleep and recovery. Let your child sleep as much as they can, which is really critical. And then the recovery is just as important by taking days off. And thank you for all these great tips, Dr. And if any parents would like to gather more great tips, we highly recommend the nemours.org website as well as the kidshealth.org website for all the greatest suggestions, tips, and best practices. Thank you again for your time, Doctor. Thank you, everybody, for joining in, and we hope this has been a really helpful session for you. Thanks again.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Doctor, take care. Thank you, everybody.